KNB is a PhD student in philosophy that curates an exceptional YouTube channel in which he expertly condenses some of the most modern philosophical thought. He discusses a wide array of topics ranging from metaethics to the philosophy of sex. In my honest opinion, some of the best philosophical videos you can find on the whole of YouTube. He is a moral anti-realist and a fallibilist. That is, in general, he believes that no belief can have a justification that guarantees its truth. Thanks for being on. You okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the kind words by way of introduction. That was.
Actually, nice. I realized in the intro I forgot something. I think when I watch your videos, you're also very fair. Like when you present points, even opposing viewpoints, I have a sense of fairness, of impartiality, of trying to capture the truth of things. That's very nice, and I think it's a bit of a rarity on YouTube sometimes. So it certainly gives you those extra credits, let's say. Okay, so I don't come from a background in philosophy, since I have a PhD in statistics. So I'm a bit of an outsider in the field. And my main interest is normative ethics, because I find it really interesting and it's applicable to politics. So as an outsider, when I first saw the definition of moral realism, that is that moral statements, we say that they're true in virtue of some mind-independent feature of the world. Correct? I immediately thought, isn't that a bit strong? Like, is that what we mean with truth? And then I got into the theories of truth and seeing like a pragmatist view of truth. There's different theories. And eventually I had to reject the view of moral realism because I think the definition that contemporary philosophers are using is a bit too ambitious. What do you think about this point? Or do
you... So, yeah, well, I mean, as you said, I am an anti-realist.
Yeah.
Now, I guess just to clarify, when we say that moral realism is committed to the mind independence of moral truth, I mean, I sort of nodded to that, but that's like open to interpretation, right? So if, for instance, you endorse something like utilitarianism and you say, you know, the morally right action is whatever maximizes happiness. Well, obviously, whether or not people are happy is dependent on the mind, right? You're talking about people's mental states. So in that sense, then, you know, we don't want to say that just being a utilitarian or holding any moral view that has concern for what people's mental states are is going to be in contradiction to moral realism. But it's maybe another way to put it is like stance independent, or when we say that it's...
No,
Oh, sorry.
No, nothing. And I think I understand. Please continue. I'll just after you finish that.
So I mean, the way to think about it is that the point of saying that moral realists are committed to mind independence is that, in principle, for a moral realist, we could all be wrong. So if you imagine a world in which everybody accepts values which entail that slavery is acceptable, a moral realist will say, like, even if everybody accepts that, they're still wrong. It might still be the case that slavery is unacceptable.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're trying to capture when we say that these values are mind independent.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, it is an ambitious position defined in that way. Of course, you know, any philosophical position, there's going to be debate about how exactly to define it. Some people say that, you know, all you need to be a moral realist is to think that some moral statements are true. Maybe we don't really need to be committed to mind independence.
Yeah. Okay. So, let me ask you this. An impression I got, as I said, from an outsider, was that the definition of moral realism was somehow historically linked to the religious idea that there's these real facts somewhere about morality. And as you said, like I got this impression that the definition of moral realism, if I had to define it before going in the field, I would use a much more pragmatic approach. I realize there's big issues in using like pragmatic definitions of truth, because we have this issue that nothing can. It seems hard to justify anything at some point. But so the question is, do you think there's a historical relationship with religion, with this definition of moral realism as it is?
Possibly, but I mean, the difficulty with that is that, I mean, historically, almost any philosophical position has been, developed through the lens of religion, because, there was a time when, at least in this culture, basically everybody was a Christian, right? And everybody was approaching things from that framework, and all of the debates were taking place within that framework. And so, I think that it may well be the case that the moral concepts that we use are sort of holdovers from a Christian worldview. Like maybe, I mean, so when we think about morality, if we think about it as like a set of rules, maybe that's connected to the idea of God laying down what the rules are. And of course, from that point of view, you can make sense of moral realism, right? You can make sense of the idea of these rules being independent of what any human thinks, or independent of anybody's desires or values, because if there's a God, and if God has specified that there are certain rules, then that's independent of us, right? That's just what we have to follow. On the other hand, this does raise the classic Euthyphro dilemma, right? So it's, if you think that there is a God and you're getting your morality from God, well, is it the case that God is just determining the moral values, or is God kind of responsive to values that hold independently? So, I mean, one way to think about this is, if God decided, as it were, that torturing babies is morally okay, would that become a moral fact, right? And so, from that point of view, it's perhaps we might think that actually this is, we can talk about morality independently of religion, and talk about issues of moral realism independently of religion. And certainly contemporary philosophers who are moral realists are generally secular. They're not committed to theism.
Okay, so that's great. So when I entered the arena of normative ethics, I had to immediately concede, thanks to some of your videos too, that the moral anti-realist position seems the most reasonable. Like, I see, just to cite one argument, Mackey's queerness argument was very convincing to me. I couldn't really, on logical, rational grounds, rebut that argument. So I'm in the position that I'm a moral anti-realist, but I do have normative ethics. So I think there's some confusion around this when I talk about people online. So me asking to an expert philosopher, is this a position that's tenable? Is it incoherent?
I do feel the need just to point out, because you said moral anti-realism on the basis of my videos seems the most reasonable. I'm glad to hear that, because that is my position. But most philosophers disagree with me. Most philosophers are moral realists.
Oh no, yeah, I know, so, I know. I've seen this. There's questions coming up on that in a moment.
Okay.
But actually, let me say something. Most YouTubers are actually, I found they're moral anti-realists. Like if I look at Cosmic Skeptic, Rationality Rules. Perspective philosophy maybe is an exception because he's a moral realist. But when I look at a lot of YouTubers that talk about philosophy, they all seem to be moral anti-realists.
Yeah.
Okay, this is just it just happens to be this way. There's just this divide. We'll talk about this more later. Is a position coherent? Can one hold this position?
Well, I think so. I continue to have moral views about things. So there are different sort of perspectives you might take as an anti-realist, right? So one form of anti-realism is known as non-cognitivism. And this is the view that when we make moral statements, we're not really even trying to describe facts about the world. We're rather expressing, emotional dispositions or sentiments or plans or something like that. So when I say slavery is wrong, although that has, so that the statement slavery is wrong, that has the same kind of surface form as a statement like grass is green, right? So it seems to be attributing a property to an action. It seems to be attributing the property of wrongness to the action of slavery. But a non-cognitivist will say, well, no, what's really going on with that kind of statement is you're expressing disapproval of slavery. Or perhaps you're like expressing a command that like don't hold slaves or something like that. And so in that case, okay, there aren't moral facts, but it's sort of a mistake to look at moral statements as even trying to state facts. So it's not the case that moral claims are false. Maybe we should say rather that they're neither true nor false or something like that. So on that kind of view,
correct.
Sorry?
But you're an error theorist, correct?
Yeah, I'm. I'm more inclined to that. I'm just sort of giving a sense of.
Go on.
So if you want to hold various normative views, one option that you have is to deny the assumption that moral statements are even in the business of, trying to describe facts about reality. So, put it this way, right? Like, imagine if I was to, hit my hand with a hammer and I was like, ow, right? And then somebody says, well, hang on a minute. There's no property of ow-iness in the world, right? So what you've said is false. So really, you shouldn't be saying that. I mean, that would just be ridiculous, right? That would be a mistake. I mean, from a non-cognitivist point of view, it's kind of the same mistake to say that, anti-realists can't hold moral views, because if you're a non-cognitivist, you're expressing your own values. So as you mentioned, my own view is a bit different. I'm inclined towards error theory, and an error theorist will say, actually, moral statements are what they seem to be, right? They seem to be propositions. That's the surface form, and we should just take them at face value. So the statement, slavery is wrong, that does in fact attribute the property of wrongness to slavery. But there's no such thing as wrongness. So turns out these statements are false. But even if you're an error theorist, you can make the same sort of move that a non-cognitivist would make. You can say, well, there's a distinction between semantics and pragmatics, right? So there's a distinction between the meaning of a statement, the literal meaning of a statement, and what you use that statement to do. So like, if I'm angry with you and I sort of shout, there's the door, well, or if you just look at the meaning of that statement, then I'm simply expressing the proposition that a door exists at a particular location. But obviously I'm doing a lot more with that statement, like I'm telling you to get out the room. So an error theorist will say, yeah, I mean, all of these moral statements are false, but we can still use them to, express values, to express emotional dispositions. We can still use them to as tools to negotiate the sort of rules of behavior that we think we want in society and so on, right? There are still all sorts of things we can use these moral statements, these falsehoods, as tools to achieve other ends, and that's the position that I'm inclined to hold. So I think that it's perfectly reasonable for an anti-realist to express moral views and try to work out a consistent moral system. As long as you're just, I suppose, attentive to like what it is that you're actually achieving, right? Like, you're not going to be describing facts about reality, but that's not the only thing we care about. There's lots of other things we care about in life beyond just describing facts,
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. But I think if I were to think about this problem naturally, the first thing that would come to mind to me would be to redefine truth. As I said in the start, like that's another. I think that's another. What do you call it? That's another route you could go down. You could go down the idea. Okay, maybe we have this definition of truth is a bit too strong. We can say something different, and then we can just say, okay, these moral facts are true. with us from the definition of truth, but this is not standard. I mean, this is not standard philosophy. The definitions are mostly set, and moral realism, everybody understands it one way.
Well, actually, there are quite a lot of philosophers who take that kind of route. So there's a project known as quasi-realism, and traditionally quasi-realists were non-cognitivists. So they were people who thought that what we're doing when we make moral statements is just expressing emotional dispositions or something along those lines. But they thought that actually we can still kind of save the sort of realist intuitions. So the idea of there being moral truths or moral facts, right? We can have all of that. And one way of, making this project work is to, like you suggest, adopt a different view of truth. I actually personally think that the question of truth is not really so important. So if somebody wants to say that there are moral truths and that's all you're committing yourself to, and you're not committing yourself to the idea of like stance independent, mind independent moral facts or anything like that, I'm not sure that I would necessarily disagree that strongly. Maybe a useful comparison here would be something like color, right? So our sort of the way that colors are presented to us is that they're presented to us as being these mind-independent properties of objects, right? So I can, look at an apple and I say the apple is red, and redness seems, in my perceptual experience, to just be a property of the apple. But of course, when we, look at the science of color vision, that turns out to be very implausible. It seems like, other organisms with different visual systems wouldn't see redness in anything like the way we would. The way that we see red is a product of, the interaction of our eyes, our particular visual system with certain wavelengths of light and so on. So, it seems like color is dependent on us. The way that we perceive color is dependent on us. It's not just this external property of objects. But that's still the way that colors seem to us. So you might be inclined to be an error theorist, right? You might say, well, actually, when I say the apple is red, that's false, because there's no such property of redness.
Yeah.
But, I mean, arguably, like, we're making... Okay, so there is an error in our way of thinking about color, right? So we think of color as being mind independent, but it's not. So that's an error. But do we have to say that all color claims are false? I mean, that's not so obvious, right? It seems like we have ways of, achieving convergence on color claims. Like I can show an apple to everybody, or almost all humans will agree that it's red, and I can maybe take a photograph of it, and then you look at the photograph and you say, oh yeah, that's a photo of a red apple. So even cameras can pick up the property that we're tracking. So if you want to say that there can be truths about color, that seems fine to me. And maybe you can similarly weaken the notion of truth and have moral truth. But I don't think that would be, I wouldn't consider that to be any kind of substantive moral realism.
Okay. So let me play devil's advocate for a moment. So if I'm a moral anti-realist, but I do have a normative morality, if somebody comes up to me and says, okay, why should I be compelled to act as your normative system, or why should I be compelled to think this is bad if you define something as bad? What do I answer to this? Let's say this person wants to torture children, and I say, no, that's bad. But then he says, but you're a moral anti-realist, so you're telling me it's bad, but it's just a false fact, what you're saying. What do you say to this guy?
So I think that there are, what I would say to that person in particular, I guess depends on the context, right? Because I think there are different ways that anti-realists can approach this. So generally speaking, when it comes to moral debates, One of the things that we can do is to try to show that people's behaviors are not consistent with the values that they themselves hold. And that's actually quite a sort of common moral argument, right? So I can show, for instance, if we're debating, let's say, animal rights, okay, because I think this is a very nice example. There are lots of people who are very strongly in favour of animal welfare laws, but at the same... Okay, can you hear that?
Yeah, maybe that's the guy who wants to.
That's my brother.
Okay.
There are people who are very strongly in favour of animal welfare laws. You know, they're appalled by bullfighting and fox hunting and things like that.
Yes,
but they are perfectly okay with eating meat. And so you might argue, look, that's just inconsistent, right? Like, if you care about the welfare of animals, then you should be opposed to killing them just for the sake of, you know, having a nice taste in your mouth. Like, why is having a nice taste in your mouth any more noble a goal than, you know, the joy that somebody might get from watching a bullfight? And so that's one thing. And you don't have to be a realist to make that argument, because you're just appealing to the values that people already hold. Another thing that you can do as an anti-realist is try to show that people are have based their moral views on incorrect empirical claims. A lot of the defences of slavery, for example, were based on the claim that black people were cognitively inferior to white people, right? And that's we could just appeal to empirical evidence to show no, that's not true, right? The idea that, you know, that there are particular races of people who are significantly less intelligent or more prone to violence or whatever, that's false. And you don't have to even get into the question of moral values there. You can just talk about empirical facts. I mean, another thing, I guess, is like you can appeal to people's self-interest, right? You can sort of say, well, you know, there are certain rules that if we all follow them would benefit everybody. So I might say, for instance, you know, the reason why I'm going to so let's say that it's somebody I don't know wanting to make loads of noise at night. You know, maybe they're playing music really loud. You might say to them, look, you know, there are nights when you want to sleep and when you wouldn't like it if I played really loud music. So why don't we just have an agreement that, you know, from 11 p.m. onwards, none of us will play really loud music at night, or something along those lines, right? So these are the sort of moves that anti-realists can make. And I think I would just point out that those are exactly the same moves that realists make. I mean, it's not as though being a realist is going to give you any arguments that anti-realists can't make with respect to the sort of first order normative questions. Because you can say, well, to take your example of the person who wants to torture babies, you can say it is an objective fact that torturing babies is wrong. But what happens if that person just says, no, it isn't. I think it's an objective fact that torturing babies is permissible. What do you do? Well, you would end up having to appeal to the sort of argumentative strategies that I've just outlined, right? You'd have to appeal to shared values or, you know, self-interest or whatever else.
Yeah, that's a great point. So with this, I'm going to briefly present you my amateurist view of like a grounding of a moral theory. So, and you're going to tell me at the end if you think this makes sense, and then if you disagree with something in it. So initially, let's say I'm a moral anti-realist, in the sense we both discussed. Okay. So from there, I make a move and I say, I think that in human beings there are some innate structures, and we have the same way of thinking about logic. We have the same ideas of what's rational, and we see the same colors, as you were saying before. And I think that a part of this human nature, of these innate structures, are some moral principles, let's say. So this is very similar to what Sidgwick says, but Sidgwick says that these are like self-evident axioms that are true. But I don't say they're true. I just say that they're just present in us, universally present. And for example, I would say that unnecessary suffering is bad. I would say it's one of these. But everyone can agree on this. But it seems to be something that's inside us. And then another one would be the suffering of somebody, of one person or another person is in principle, there shouldn't be an attribution of difference between the suffering of two equal persons. So we have these sort of innate moral claims within us, and from them, I think if you coherently draw on these sort of biological axioms, if you want to call them like that, you get a consequentialist utilitarian framework. So this is this is basically my grounding of my theory. So first, does this make sense? Does this make sense in your opinion?
I'm following it. I disagree. But yeah. I mean,
okay, you disagree?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So at least it makes sense, but you disagree. Okay, great. So at least it makes sense. Now to the disagreement. Go on.
Yeah, I think that I'm much more on the sort of social constructivist side of when it comes to the view of human nature. So I think that, like, even in the case of logic, for instance, I'm not sure that there are any universal principles that all people agree with. It's a little bit difficult to kind of evaluate these sort of claims because, so for instance, there is an argument that, like, what they called the Azande. There's some literature on Azande logic, there's some small scale society, I think in Africa or something, and there's an argument that they use a different logical system. The problem with these sorts of claims is that there are ways that people just kind of naturally reason in, like, natural language, and then when we are doing formal logic, there are going to be different ways of formalizing those moves. So it's kind of like how somebody can state an argument and then you can formalize it in propositional logic, or you can formalize it in quantified logic, or you can formalize it in modal logic, depending on how much detail you want to draw out, right? So I suppose if you keep it really, really simple and really abstract, maybe you can find certain logical principles that hold universally. But just to give a perhaps less controversial example, so among philosophers, most philosophers accept classical logic and will deny that there can be true contradictions, but there are some philosophers who think that there are true contradictions, and they endorse a kind of paraconsistent logic. So there is a debate, between two people who seem to be, very well informed and very educated, so they know what they're talking about, and yet they hold different logical systems. They don't endorse the same laws of logic. So I don't know.
Surely to argue their point, they're going to use the rules of logic we normally use.
Well, the problem is they disagree on what the rules of logic we normally use are. So this is. I get your point though, right? Because part of the problem here is that there's a kind of way of reasoning, like a natural rationality, and then there's the question of how we formalize it. I don't see any. I mean, it seems like people can differ on this though. So yeah, I'm inclined to be more sort of constructivist about even the case of logic. So I guess that's actually. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, but I mean, we can kind of put that to one side, because even if we accept that there are, like, laws of logic that are universal, or logical axioms that are universal, I have more problems with the idea of, like, universal moral axioms. I mean, you said that we can all agree that unnecessary suffering is bad.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that. I don't really moralize suffering. So I don't know
So
where you.
there's a counter example, I
So
guess. No,
here's an
no.
example.
Yeah. But so just to answer to that, I mean, I think you raise a valid point there that for not everybody, suffering can be bad. But I think I accept that. I think like when we say something is universal for human beings, it's not that it holds for every single human being. Like we might say like every human being sees in 3 dimensions,
Yeah.
and then somebody is born blind and I don't say they see 0 dimensions, but we would still say it's universal that humans see in 3 dimensions or something like that. But I don't really want to argue I just wanted to know if it was sensible from a philosophical standpoint. I don't really want to argue
Oh, I mean, there are definitely
my
ways of defending this kind of view. Yeah, I mean, like, so
yeah.
don't get me wrong. I mean, and I should say that look, my positions on some topics, I mean, especially when it comes to the logic thing, are pretty extreme, probably. So but there was one thing that I did actually want to say,
Yeah.
because you'd mentioned that one of the things that was universal was this kind of move to impartiality. Like you
Oh
said
yeah,
that.
that's hotly debated. That's hotly debated. Yeah. Go on, go on.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess it was more just a question, which was, it seems to me like if we're going to be making these sort of claims about innate rules or innate axioms or something like that,
Yeah.
then the natural place to look would be, evolution, right? That's going to be what has inculcated these things in us. But
Yes.
surely I would have thought you'd expect some sort of rule favoring partiality, through things like kin selection or something like that. I mean, so people are going to have evolved to have more concern for, those they are closest to than they will for like. I mean, there's no reason why anybody would have evolved to have concern for like humans in general. So I don't know if that's.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me say something about that. So, let me just reflect a minute. That makes perfect sense, but there's something I don't know. Like I'm trying to avoid using like Peter Singer's words on this because this is something that's been brought up a lot with him, and basically the way he puts it, he says, we rationally recognize that this rule that's been brought out by evolution, let's say, the reason itself why it's being brought out by evolution is that okay, it's just for our kin, our group. But when we think about it logically and rationally, we obviously we recognize that this rule shouldn't be only applicable to people of our group, but even to others. So in this way, this is a Peter Singer move that he uses to sort of sidestep all those evolutionary debunking arguments. He says, okay, we have these things because of evolution, but then thanks to our reason, we see that these rules should be applied in a broader setting. So this is one answer that I think Singer would give. I think another answer is that I think we can recognize that our group at a certain point does become the whole group of humans. Like we're all in the same boat at a certain level. Like we can now recognize that this is something that maybe wasn't true in the ancient times, but now it's, let's say we see these problems of global warming and all these big problems that face us, and we do recognize that we're all actually in the same group and we should all care about the suffering of each other. I think these are 2 answers I could possibly give to that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, yeah, as I said, I don't want to really debate this. I just really wanted more confirmation that it made sense from a philosophical standpoint, and thankfully it does.
Yeah, I think people have defended these sorts of views in the literature, so it's not like it's not like a crazy position or anything.
Yeah. So let me ask you instead about your moral theory. So do I gather this right? You're an intuitionist. Is that correct?
I'm not. Well, not exactly. I mean, not really. I don't see myself that way. I think that the thing is that ultimately there's not a lot that you can really foundationally base moral theorizing on, and it seems that pretty much everybody engages in this appeal to moral intuitions. Like when we're trying to evaluate what the best moral theory is, it's very hard to see how to proceed if you just try to do away with moral intuitions entirely. And so, I mean, some of like the classic examples of this are when, you know, somebody will propose a theory like utilitarianism, and then you have a case such as, you know, the organ stealing case, where somebody comes into a hospital and, you know, a doctor might steal 5 of their organs and distribute them to 5 people who are dying. Okay, so then you've got 5 versus 1. So we use these sort of cases to prompt our intuitions. And I mean, you might argue that cases like that are maybe just like you can't really conclude much from them because they're just, you know, wild and so unlike any real world scenario or whatever. But even putting that aside, it's just hard to see how you can get anywhere if you try to do away with moral intuitions entirely. And one of the, as I see it, benefits of being an anti-realist is that there's no problem about what the like justification is of appealing to moral intuitions. Because if you're a realist, you're going to have to answer a question about, well, why exactly should we think that intuitions are truth tracking? You know, in the case of something like perception, you know, I can tell a story about how, you know, an object in the world, light reflects off it, hits my eyes, and so I can tell a story about how my sensory data is connected to things in the world. It's not at all obvious what sort of story we would tell for the case of moral intuitions. So I mean, the reason why I don't call myself an intuitionist is because I don't feel like I rely on intuitions and, you know, to any greater extent than anybody else does. But I imagine we probably all do to some extent.
Okay, so in like according to in the 3 big normative theories, let's say virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism or consequentialism, where do you find yourself? Like, where's your camp, or you have another camp?
I would favour some sort of contractarianism. So the way that I like to approach moral debates is I like to see morality as being a product of sort of rules that are constructed by rational agents negotiating in what they take to be in their best, you know, self-interest in the long run. So the reason why I like to, and this is, you know, it's not like I'm saying this is what morality is. I'm just saying this is how I like to approach it, right? I like to approach it in terms of, you know, okay, so there are certain rules, and, you know, we can specify rules where if we all agree to constrain our behavior in accordance with these rules, it makes us all better off, right? It would promote my self-interest if everybody conformed to a certain rule. So if we all agree to conform to a certain rule with respect to, you know, property, for instance, well, that makes me better off. I'm not particularly strong. I wouldn't be very good at defending my my possessions in a world where everybody can just come and take whatever they want from me. You know, so if we all agree to a certain property convention, I'm probably better off in that kind of world, right? The reason why I like to approach morality this way is that it seems to me that this is just the best way of persuading other people, right? Is to if you can say that a certain moral rule is actually in their self-interest, then that seems like it's gonna have more force than, you know, if I just say like because the problem is, right, if we're having a moral debate about like homosexuality, and somebody says, you know, I feel that homosexuality is wrong, well, I might say, you know, I feel it's fine, but why should they care? Why should my emotional reactions move them at all? Whereas if I can say that actually it's in your self-interest to live in a world where we respect what people do in their own private life, because hey, maybe you have certain things that you want to do in your private life that other people might, not like, right? That seems like it's probably going to have more force. But
yeah,
does that make sense?
So yeah, that makes sense. So you're a contractarianist, but when you say like, but it seems to me like you're talking in deontological terms. So you have these rules that are given, you justify them through a social contract, but you have some rules you would basically appeal to at the end. Is that right?
It's I think usually classed as a type of deontology.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's nice to know. Okay. Well, recently, as you probably know, the Phil Paper survey came out, and this is a survey where professional philosophers give their answers to survey questions on their philosophical positions. And moral realism, as you were saying before, is accepted by 62% of the respondents.
Yeah.
I'm baffled by that.
Well, actually, it's even more baffling because there's also a lot of other. So there's others, right? So anti-realism is only, what is it, 25% or something, 26%.
Yeah, something around.
So actually, it's even worse than it sounds, because it's not the case that there are 38% anti-realists. There's only 26% anti-realists, and then a bunch of people who didn't choose either. So yeah.
So in your opinion, how come? What is the strong argument for moral realism that most people, of course, you might not know, but what's an educated guess?
That's that's a difficult question to answer, because I don't think moral realism has got anything going for it. So I mean, you're asking about what's the strong argument for moral realism? Honestly, I don't think there is one. I think I can probably it depends on like what your sort of framework is coming into philosophy. So why is it that most philosophers are moral realists? Well, a lot of philosophers have over the last few decades, I think especially, come to the view that philosophy has to sort of respect common sense, right? Like, philosophy is seen as providing explanations for why it is that certain things we accept to be true are true. It's not involved in the project of just like overthrowing what we think we know about the world. So maybe a good way to explain this would be something like, if you think about arguments for external world skepticism, so the view that, well, maybe how do I know I'm not just a brain in a vat, or how do I know I'm not in the Matrix, or something like that. A lot of philosophers will say, the role of philosophy should be to explain how it is we have knowledge of the world, and they're just taking it as an assumption that we do have knowledge of the world. So any philosophical theory which entails that I don't know that I have hands, for instance, or that I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, you can just sort of rule that out, from the start, as it were. And I think that the same sort of attitude is brought to the question of moral realism, and the attitude is often, well, there's just all sorts of things that we know to be moral facts. So we know it's a fact that torturing babies is wrong, and like any philosophical theory which entails that it's not a fact that torturing babies is wrong, that in itself tells you that there's something wrong with that philosophical theory. So maybe like a way to put it is, it's more plausible that it's a fact that torturing babies is wrong than whatever philosophical premise you want to use in an argument for anti-realism. So I think there's a lot of philosophers who kind of hold that sort of approach.
Okay, so that makes sense. So why? But at this point, I would say, why not just redefine truth then? Like, maybe I'm getting stuck on this point, but if we want to say that, I mean, I understand the spirit. Like, we use these moral claims all the time, and it certainly seems as if they're true. But why just redefine it in a way that is more,
Well,
I don't
I
know.
mean, I suppose different philosophers will have different answers to that. I mean, there are lots of objections to, alternative theories of truth. I think actually, if you look at that survey, how many people accepted the correspondence theory of truth? It's most of them, I think. There was a question about truth on there. So
Yeah, there
yeah,
was. Yeah, no, I think most accepted the correspondence theory of truth. Yeah,
yeah.
but I find equally I find a bit strange too.
But I mean,
I mean,
there are other there are other arguments that have. So I mean, one argument, for instance, that has become very popular and that a lot of philosophers seem to find convincing anyway, is the idea that, well, moral claims are sort of in the same boat as other claims that we should obviously be realists about. And I'm actually not sure we should obviously be realists about these other claims, but so claims about whether or not beliefs are justified, for instance, or what you rationally ought to do, or what you rationally ought to believe. So these are like epistemic norms. This is known as the companions in guilt argument.
mm-hmm.
So there are philosophers who have argued that the case for moral anti-realism will generalize beyond moral norms, and it will also condemn epistemic norms. And if it's it's one thing to say that there's no fact to the matter about what we morally ought to do, but it's quite another thing to say that there are no facts about what we ought to believe, or what it is rational to believe, or what we are justified in believing. So if those kinds of arguments are successful, then perhaps see why people find.
Of course, you have no problem with epistemic anti-realism either.
Oh no,
So
I mean,
those
I think
arguments-
that these arguments are terrible. I don't find it remotely convincing. But it's one among. I mean, actually, the other thing is just if you look at that survey, philosophers seem to be quite attracted to realist approaches in general. It's not like moral realism is unusual in this respect. There's also a lot of people who. There was a question about abstract objects, Platonism versus nominalism, and Platonism is like the realist view, and there are a lot of Platonists. So, I mean, realism has always been a popular approach. There are lots and lots of philosophers who think that the way in which we should explain a particular discourse is by postulating things beyond experience. Which can serve as the truth conditions for that discourse, of which successful statements in that discourse are true of. That's a very, very popular move.
Yeah, but so bringing it back to the fact that maybe these philosophers are trying to capture popular sentiment, I actually kind of disagree. I feel like if I were to go to a person walking down the street reasonably, and I were to ask him, did the sun rise yesterday? He would say, yeah, that's a true fact. Then if I were to tell him, well, how do you know that, I don't know, an evil demon tricked your senses, you were born yesterday, or something like that? I feel he would readily agree and say, oh yeah, of course I can't know, like, to that extent, but we all share this. I kind of feel like the popular approach is not to like deny the truth, it's just to say, okay, but we don't. A reasonable person would just say, yeah, I can't possibly prove that I was alive yesterday in your terms, but we all accept this as truth and we just move on from there. Maybe I'm completely mistaken on this because this is just...
No, I agree. I think, so it's not so much that philosophers are trying to capture what's popular, it's more like, look, there are various like claims that we will just, like, most people will just normally endorse, and so yeah, I mean, it may well be the case that if you ask somebody, if you sort of sit somebody down and get them to think about it, and you sort of say, but how do you really know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? How do you know that you're not a brain in a vat? Then they may well withdraw their claims. But in the normal course of events, they just will endorse the claim that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, that they have hands, and that it's wrong to torture babies. So it's those sort of pre-theoretical intuitions that philosophers are trying to accommodate.
I see. So regarding the Phil paper survey, what surprised you the most on it?
Um, what did surprise me the most? I feel like I'd have to like actually look at the Phil Papers survey. I know that there were some surprises on there, but like it's just like now off the top of my head. Okay, let me think, because I know that there were some
We
surprises.
can.
No,
I mean, I can edit.
this is interesting. This is what it's all about. This is just this is what happens when you talk about stuff. Um, yeah, okay. So there was a question on there about the aim of philosophy. Um,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, one of the early questions. And so I mean, so I should say I don't really think it makes sense to talk about like the aim of philosophy. It makes sense to talk about aims that particular individuals have. Or aims that particular groups have, but the idea that a whole discipline like philosophy has a particular aim seems a bit silly to me. But there were still people who were answering that question as it was asked, and surprising that only 22% said goodness slash justice, because you could select more than one option for that. And I mean, there are whole fields of philosophy where it seems like goodness and justice is in fact the aim. Ethics and political philosophy. I mean, especially bearing in mind how many moral realists there are, right? Like, you'd think that there'd be more than 22% who would go for goodness slash justice as the aim. So
Yeah,
that was a
especially,
surprise.
yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I would tick like most boxes. If I can select multiple, I would just like basically select most of them in that question. But yeah, that was surprising. Oh, by the way, there's an interesting thing.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, nothing. On the full paper survey, I've noticed an interesting. I mean, you can divide the survey by subgroups. So by type of philosophers who answered it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can go and see, and this was interesting to me because, of course, I'm a consequentialist. So I was a bit sad that consequentialists ranked third among the popular moral theories.
That's
and then
yeah.
yeah, that's pretty bad for me. No, but apart from that, if you select like philosophers, the survey only for people who study philosophy of science or logic, then consequentialist is actually the first. It's actually like 46%, 50% of the respondents.
Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe because of my background, that I come from a more mathematical, statistical background, I see that theory as a more complete theory, or let's say a more elegant theory than the others, and that's why I selected. So maybe there's these kinds of effects in place.
I mean,
interesting.
yeah. I mean, probably. I think there's also some research which shows. I can't remember. This might just be a load of crap. I might be inventing this off the top of my head, but I'm sure I remember reading some research which showed that people who are psychopaths tend to have more consequentialist intuitions.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I've seen. Yeah, I've seen those studies.
That is a real thing. It actually makes perfect sense, of course, because the way that. Well, I mean, I don't mean that in a rude way, but obviously the sort of scenarios that we use against consequentialism. Like, oh, if there's a trolley going down the track and you can push a man and in front of the trolley to say, then it makes sense that a psychopath would be quite happy to just be like, yep, just push him, calculate it. But if you,
I think consequentialism gets this kind of I think that it's true. Like people see consequentialists as these kind of cold calculators.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm like one of the most empathetic persons that there is. So I don't really see myself in that. But to answer your point, I've seen even a lot of papers, maybe a couple, that see that people that are more rational support consequentialism. So maybe you could say, being a psychopath, you're not clouded by emotional stuff. This is a weak defense, I guess, but.
Well, I mean, look, you don't need to defend it to me. I mean, like I say, my approach is that when we construct moral rules, it's entirely for the purposes of long-run self-interest. So, I'm explicitly designing my system to be hospitable to psychopaths. But it makes sense that people, I think, from that sort of more mathematical background would, you'd asked me what surprises were.
Yeah.
So this
Go
was
on.
another big surprise. In fact, this might have been the biggest surprise of all. If you look at the 2009 survey, virtue ethics was the minority. It was the least popular. I think it was on
Yeah.
something like 18%. And
Yeah.
in this survey, it's the most popular, 37% or something like that.
Yeah. It's most.
Yeah, so virtue ethics has had a massive increase, and I have no idea why. I have no idea what happened there. As far as I'm aware, like that, I'm not. Well, I haven't been made aware that there's any, major contributions to the virtue ethics literature that would have changed people's minds about that so rapidly in just 10 years.
And historically, the two biggest moral theories have always been deontology and consequentialism, if I'm not mistaken. Like, there's always even been this problem of trying to fit them together.
Yeah.
So virtue ethics was always like the outsider, but it's at first place. I also don't know about any strong arguments that came out in this span of time, but I understand the appeal of virtue ethics. In fact, as a consequentialist, I would say that when I go about my daily life, I do act according to the tenets of kind of virtue ethics, because I don't like stop and calculate. Of course, stop and calculating the outcomes of any action is counterproductive.
Yeah.
At some point, you won't be actually maximizing utility if you do something like that. So I do understand the appeal of virtue ethics, but I wasn't expecting the first place in that kind of, So I totally agree with that. And instead, so you're from an analytic philosophy background, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what do you think about continental philosophy? What do you think the difference is? Because I kind of find competing definitions of how continental philosophy and analytic philosophy differ. So maybe you can give me your idea as an expert in the field.
I feel like I don't know enough about continental philosophy to to say anything about it. It's just not my field. So I mean, I'm just not really sure. It seems to me that the difference is at this point basically one of style. Analytic philosophers they care a lot about giving precise definitions of terms, and they appeal to formal methods very often, like formal logic or formal probability theory. You find that a lot in analytic philosophy. Continental philosophers are maybe a bit more literary. But I don't know, actually. I've not read much continental philosophy, so I don't know.
I understand. When I try to read continental philosophy, I struggle a lot.
Yeah.
Because of the things you said previously. Like I have this position, I think, that I'm kind of skeptical you can actually reach any knowledge at all without clear and proper definitions. So I found their works more like compelling and interesting as literature, as a piece of art.
I mean, it may be. I don't necessarily want to want to make generalizations about a field I don't really know. But so I'm just thinking back to like the times when I did courses in continental philosophy. I remember that there was one where I remember saying to the lecturer, or like it was. We'd read this piece and we were discussing it, and I kind of brought up this objection to, like, I was like, well, how are you going to know that anything, like, it was basically like, it seemed that the piece was being written from a kind of first person point of view, and it was sort of about looking at like the structures of experience and stuff, and I was like, well, I mean, how is there any way of confirming like whether or not the first personal account of the structures of experience, how can we confirm whether or not that's right? Like, there's no way I can access somebody else's mind. And so I was making these sorts of points, and I sort of said, it seems like you're not even going to get to truth this way. Maybe it's more like narrative or fiction or something. And then the lecturer was just like, oh yeah, that's what it is. So I was like, oh, okay. Well, fair enough. yeah, I mean, it maybe has different goals. I do think that there is some utility in sort of letting a thousand flowers bloom when it comes to philosophy. Like part of the point of philosophy, it seems to me, is kind of mapping out conceptual space and maybe figuring out different ways of thinking about things. I'm not going to say that the analytic approach, the analytic style, is always the best way of
Yeah, no.
proceeding for that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that either. No, I completely agree. It's good to have different approaches. I just like personally, I really can't extract much knowledge at all out of continental philosophers, even if I can enjoy their writings a lot, and they can give me ideas. Actually, they can give me ideas that I can formalize, then that I can then like kind of put on what I would consider firm background, even if there's not really such a thing. But yeah, so I think we kind of agree here. Okay, so I want to jump to another thing that to me is very interesting, and I think you're extraordinarily good at doing, as I said in my introduction. And this is condensing information. I find that your videos, maybe some viewers don't appreciate this, or probably maybe they do, but you even talk about sometimes current thoughts. You cite modern papers, and you manage to encapsulate, in my opinion, the knowledge or highlight the meatier parts of these of the topics you discuss. Do you think there's a lot of value in? I certainly do, but is this what you set out to do?
The intention that I had when I started the channel was that I wanted to learn the material myself. So it was entirely selfish. I was interested in learning stuff, and I felt that it's always seemed to be that the best way to learn something is to try to communicate it to other people. Like that's when you really know you understand something. If you can teach something to somebody else, then you know you understand it. And so that was really what motivated me. It was like, well, the best way of learning is figuring out how to talk to somebody else, how to teach it to someone else. But obviously the channel has become a bit more than that now, and I do think there's a great value in what I do. I mean, yeah, I like because I love philosophy. I think it's a good thing to get philosophy out there into the public. And philosophers, there's this idea that there is a kind of problem in philosophy, right? Where philosophy is like there's a lot of people who just don't know what philosophy is, and even among people who do know what it is, a lot of them just don't care about it. And so, like, if you were to go to the average person in the street and ask them to describe what philosophy is, a lot of them just wouldn't be able to say anything. So there's a bit of a crisis in terms of like philosophy's public relations, right? And I think that there's no reason in terms of the like content of contemporary philosophy why that should be, because actually the stuff that philosophers talk about I think is fascinating, and it's interesting to many people if we could only communicate it to them and get them engaged with it. I think that these are questions that people actually like thinking about. I mean, so to take the metaethics question, moral realism versus anti-realism, this is something that plenty of people outside of philosophy find really engaging. And so, there's no reason at all why they shouldn't be engaged. We just have to work more to communicate the material. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah, you do an extremely good job at doing that. And you manage to put things in simple terms. But I think the only way to really transmit knowledge is to put things in simple terms. And I know I hold this, maybe this is a radical thought, but I think that it's really the only approach. Even in mathematics and statistics, you simplify a thing, and then learning must be simple. Like understanding an argument must be simple.
Yeah.
would you agree with this?
Well, that's the way that I like to see it. You've got to break things down into simple, straightforward steps. I mean,
Yeah,
actually, that's probably
yeah,
why I'm attracted to something like analytic philosophy in the first place, because analytic philosophers, you know, like you say, right, they care about making everything precise and breaking things down into very clear steps. So I suppose that's really just how it's done. Obviously, you know, a layperson wouldn't necessarily be able to just open up an analytic philosophy journal. There's a lot of, you know, jargon and a complexity there. But yeah, I mean, I see that as important.
Okay, so if I were to ask you the position you hold the most confidence in, what would it be?
Uh, so this is the philosophical position, right? I assume
Yeah.
philosophical
Well,
position.
you can do whatever. You can say political position.
Oh
That would
well,
be
I
interesting
no,
too.
I mean, so the reason I wouldn't be able to say political position because I don't really see that. It's difficult to assess confidence with respect to one's political views when you're an anti-realist because it's not obvious what you're actually saying you're confident about. You know, like so if I'm, you know, I can say that I'm, you know, very confident that my car is parked outside because I take it that I'm, you know, describing a truth about the world. But like if I say I'm, you know, confident in my political views or my moral views, I don't know, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're like,
Well, according to how you defined yourself before, wouldn't that mean like I'm confident that this would result in in a social contract that would benefit you and me and benefit everybody?
yeah, I guess
Like,
that's one way to think about it, is that maybe it's confidence in that like conditional, that, you know, if we do this, then we will achieve such and such. Yeah, I'm not remotely confident in my political views at all. I mean, like it's one reason why I don't like engage in. I mean, I do sometimes express them, but like if you force me to say what my political views are, I'd probably say I'm some sort of individualist anarchist. But I don't really know anything about economics. I don't know anything about the current political situation. I have no idea how we would actually get to the sort of ideal society that I have in mind. It's purely like abstract philosophical. That's what it is to me. So I'm not confident in that at all. No, so the position that I'm most confident in is like, oh man, that's a difficult question. I mean, I'd be kind of inclined, like, I might, maybe it is moral anti-realism. I mean, I really do think that the case for realism is just non-existent. I don't think there's any arguments for it that are even remotely persuasive. I think there are very good reasons to think that it's false. But you know, we've already talked about that, and it feels like I should say something different than that. But that's
no,
probably my
no, you don't
that
have
is
to. You don't
probably
have
actually
to.
my position. I mean, maybe also atheism about at least certain conceptions of God, like the traditional, you know, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. If you're using that like traditional theist definition, then but then even then, I mean, I'm not like, I don't know. It's a topic I don't care. I don't care enough about the topic to be really confident about it, to be honest.
But
So yeah.
okay, so let me ask you curiosity. So when you work as a PhD student, you meet many other philosophers, and so you're probably going to meet many other moral realists too. And does this happen? Do you have arguments, or does this? So, for example, during my PhD, you don't really have many arguments about statistics with other PhD students or
Yeah.
professors. But maybe in your case, I don't know. Does this happen? You have these debates in real life?
Yeah, of course. I mean, philosophers love debating stuff. I will say that, I mean, so my background is in philosophy of science, and so philosophers of science, I guess they just, I mean, you know, metaethics isn't part of that field, so they don't talk about it as often. Although, actually, I think that there are probably more anti-realists among philosophers of science. I haven't looked this up. I haven't, but
Oh
I'm
yeah,
going to after this.
we can too. We
Yeah.
can after
I'm
look
going
it
to
up.
do
Yeah.
that. I reckon that there'll be more anti-realists if you select philosophy of science as a thing. But anyway, yeah, of course I have these debates, and I think that's just part of philosophy, isn't it? You know, you have these conversations. I'm not
But how do they?
really the sort of person who gets like heated about stuff. Like I'm not, you know, this isn't like a battle, you know. It's more just a conversation.
It seems like a moral realist would get heated more than a moral anti-realist. I'd have this kind of...
Yeah, they do. They do. They get.
They do.
Yeah.
So,
You know,
so
I had like I did have it happened twice. I had a great education, right? All of the lecturers were fantastic, but I did have two of the lecturers who, like, they weren't like angry, right? But they were, you know, very explicitly realist, and they thought anti-realism was just unacceptable. And one of them, right, like wrote on the, because you know, we were just sort of talking. It was a class on utilitarianism actually, and like he had asked people, like, you know, which of you are utilitarians, which of you are deontologists, you know, any virtue ethicists. It was just like an introductory
then
thing.
he got angry with people after you
Well,
asked them.
no,
Like,
no, this is the thing. So it was just an introductory thing. And then he was like, are there any anti-realists? And of course, so first of all, I was like, wait a minute, I didn't say this, but I thought to myself, hang on, you're conflating normative ethics with metaethics, first of all. But secondly, I am an anti-realist. So I was like, yeah, I'm an anti-realist. And there was another guy there who was also an anti-realist. And the lecturer, like, he just got up and he like wrote on the board, the Holocaust was wrong. And he was like, you know, so this is what you're denying, right? Like,
but this actually happens a lot. This actually happens a lot, even on in YouTube discourse. If you're like a moral anti-realist, they would say, "Oh yeah, you can't." For you, the Holocaust is right,
Yeah.
but of course, it's wrong for you too. You're just denying that this fact that it's wrong is mind independent, and yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting that a professor did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is something from a ex-PhD student to another PhD student. In my PhD experience, I noticed that, this is going to be a bit controversial, I think, but I noticed that some professors, this is especially noticeable in statistics or maths courses, some professors don't know what they're talking about. Like, I know this is very controversial, I know, but like in math and stats, you can't say something that, I mean, we have some shared axioms. So when you say something is like that, we know very easily that it's not. And in my experience, I've encountered, I didn't go to a top university, so maybe that's a problem, but professors that actually say things that are false. This is not the majority, but there's some that actually kind of bullshit their way across the whole course with saying, like, not giving actual proofs of things. And I was wondering if you encountered anything like this in your, or maybe you can't say anything.
I don't think so. I mean, like, I should say that this guy who did this thing with the Holocaust is wrong. I mean, like, I don't know if he was being entirely serious. I'm not sure, but it's not like he was just ignorant of moral anti-realism. Like, you can't be ignorant of moral anti-realism. You can't have gone that far in philosophy and just be unaware of it as a position. But
it seems very strange he would do something like that.
It was a bit weird. But I mean, look, sometimes people are going to just make mistakes. There are a couple of examples of people who've, you know, made errors, but nothing major. I mean, I would say that, like, I don't really know. There are very large gaps in my own philosophical knowledge, and I've had to teach stuff because I worked as a teaching assistant, where honestly, like, I feel like I didn't really know what I was talking about. I mean, I knew it well enough to kind of communicate what needed to be communicated, but, you know, I had to teach Kant on Kant's metaphysics.
Oh, that seems oh god.
And like, I don't actually really know it. I mean, I know it. I obviously read the material that I had to read beforehand, and, you know, I read some secondary literature and all of this. But honestly, I still consider that to be a pretty major gap in my knowledge, because that's something that I think every philosopher is sort of supposed to know quite well, and honestly, I don't. Yeah. So, you know, it doesn't surprise me. I think that, like, the truth is that, yeah, sometimes maybe you miss a course, and so you're not taught something important, or maybe you just forget.
Yeah,
It's bound to happen.
but I'm pretty sure, like, if a student asked you what your level of confidence was on this, or like,
Yeah.
I think your experience is actually very common among PhD students. But the way I deal with it is just I say, I don't know the proof. I don't know the proof of this. I just like admit my ignorance on some things because it would seem a bit foolish to just, I don't know, pretend. But I feel like this pretend approach is actually a bit more persuasive than what I thought because, yeah, but yeah, I guess there's no question in this last part.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
I can
so-
buy it. You can just totally bullshit your way through things, can't you? I mean, because who is going to know, right? Who's going to know that you're wrong? You have to
the
be an
students don't
expert.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but students don't know. If I like say this is the derivation of Ito's formula, and I just say this is a proof Ito gave, like they have no idea. And following some courses after I had the knowledge, I see that some professors actually do this, and yeah, it was kind of it was a big epiphany for me because I had such respect for professors in general, but I still have a lot of respect for the majority of professors. But yeah, well, I guess from my side, that's it. This is nice and brief, and I don't know. I really appreciated having you on. As usual, you're very clear in your
hang on a
thoughts.
minute. Somebody's coming in.
Okay.
Can you close the door?
Yeah, sorry, man.
I'll come out. That was my brother.
No, I was saying one who was he was screaming before. Why was he screaming? Any ideas?
He's very noisy. That's just what he does.
Oh, okay.
Just
No,
makes noise.
No, I was saying, yeah, as usual, very clear and concise, and I really appreciate. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say I really appreciate your YouTube channel. And yeah, if you have any questions for me, or we can say.
There wasn't anything in particular. Thanks a lot for having me on. That was a fun conversation. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay, this is where we're going to cut the video.